The morning Lucy Langley arrived in Dusty Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, the very first thing three different women told her, before she had even lifted her traveling bag from the stage, was that Stephen Townsend was the most handsome, most capable, and most hopelessly closed-off man in the entire county, and that she ought not to waste a single breath trying to reach whatever heart he kept locked up behind that sun-bronzed chest of his. Lucy set her bag down on the dry earth of the main street, smoothed the front of her blue traveling dress, and said, "We will see about that," in such a calm and certain tone that the three women exchanged glances and decided right then that this newcomer was either very brave or very foolish, and they could not yet tell which. She had come to Dusty Creek because her uncle, Harold Langley, had left her a small parcel of farmland when he passed in February. It was not grand land. It sat on the eastern edge of the valley, where the creek ran thin in summer, and the soil had a stubborn clay streak that made plowing a personal argument between a farmer and the earth itself. But it was hers, and Lucy Langley, 24 years old and with no family left in Missouri worth staying for, had decided that owning something real in this world was worth whatever hardship came with it. She took a room at the Dusty Creek boarding house, run by a stout and warm-hearted woman named Mabel Greer, who fed her biscuits and gravy before she had even signed the ledger, and told her everything she needed to know about the town in approximately 11 minutes. The mercantile was run by George Fitch, who kept fair prices. The doctor, a Dr. Alton Bray, was competent and sober, which was more than could be said for the previous one. The sheriff, a man named Holt Prout, was decent enough but slow to act. The saloon was the Golden Spur, and Lucy should not go there alone at night. And Stephen Townsend owned the largest working cattle ranch in the valley, the Townsend Spread, which bordered the western edge of several properties, including, as luck or fate would have it, the northern fence line of Lucy's inherited land. "He is a good rancher," Mabel said, pouring coffee as if she were dispensing medicine. "Best with cattle in 4 counties. Knows weather before the clouds do, honest as the day is long. But love," she shook her head slowly, "that man has decided love is a weakness he does not have time for. His father was the same way, his grandfather before that. It is bred into them Townsend men like the color of their eyes." "What color are his eyes?" Lucy asked, because she was practical and liked to know what she was dealing with. "Gray," Mabel said, "like the sky before a storm." Lucy went to bed that night in the small upstairs room thinking about clay soil and irrigation, and what she would need from the mercantile to get started. And if she thought at all about storm-gray eyes, she kept that thought to herself. The first time she actually saw Stephen Townsend was 3 days later, at the feed and supply store on the north end of town. She had gone to ask about a plow that George Fitch did not carry and had been directed to the supply store, where a man behind the counter named Pete Dawes was in the middle of an animated conversation with a tall figure whose back was to the door when Lucy walked in. He was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent every day of his adult life doing genuine physical work, not the soft-shouldered breadth of someone who simply ate well. He wore a worn brown duster, trail-stained at the hem, and a hat the color of tobacco that sat low on his head. When he turned because Pete Dawes glanced past him toward the door, Lucy got her first look at his face. He was, she would admit to herself later and only to herself, startlingly good-looking in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors sometimes are weathered but clean-lined, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved with intention, and that storm-gray gaze Mabel had mentioned, which settled on Lucy with an expression of mild, polite indifference that somehow felt more pointed than a stare would have. "Morning," he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried. "Good morning," Lucy replied, equally unhurried, and stepped up to the counter to speak to Pete Dawes about her plow. She was aware, in the way a person is sometimes aware of a fire in the room even when they are not looking at it, that Stephen Townsend did not immediately leave. He finished whatever he had been discussing with Pete, picked up the leather saddlebag he had rested against the counter, and walked toward the door. He paused there, "You are the Langley woman," he said, "Harold's niece." "I am," Lucy said, not turning around fully, though she looked at him over her shoulder. "Lucy Langley." "Stephen Townsend," he said. "Your north fence line is down in 2 places. You will want to fix that before you put any livestock on the property." And then he was gone, boots on the boardwalk, the door swinging gently on its hinges behind him. Pete Dawes watched the door close and then looked at Lucy with the expression of a man witnessing something slightly unusual. "He does not usually volunteer information," he said. "Mostly he just collects his order and goes." Lucy turned back to the counter and the matter of the plow, but she filed the information away. She spent her first 2 weeks getting the farmhouse habitable. It was not in ruin. Harold had been tidy in his way, but it needed airing and cleaning. A new pump washer, 2 replaced window panes, and a great deal of elbow grease on the kitchen. She hired a local man named Silas Crane, who was 60 years old, half-deaf, and an expert with a hammer, to help her with the structural repairs. Together they patched the roof over the kitchen, replaced the broken porch boards, and fixed one of the 2 down fence sections. The second one stumped them because it sat at the very corner where her property met the Townsend spread's boundary, and 3 of the fence posts had rotted clean through at the base. She was wrestling with one of the rotted posts, having decided that she would simply do it herself rather than wait, when she heard a horse and looked up to find Stephen Townsend sitting astride a magnificent gray-dun gelding at the fence line 20 feet away, watching her with those steady gray eyes. "You are going to pull that wrong," he said, without moving from the saddle. "Pull it toward you and it will take the wire with it and cut your hands." "Then how should I pull it?" she asked, not releasing the post. "Rock it left, then right, work the base loose first, then pull." She looked at the post, then back at him, then followed his instruction. The post came free without incident and without taking the wire with it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the post she was holding, then at the line of fence, then at her, and seemed to conduct some internal conversation that she was not party to. He dismounted, tied his horse to the standing post nearest him, and walked over. "I can see to this section," he said. "The corner posts are on my side of the line. It is partly my responsibility." "I appreciate that," Lucy said, "but I am perfectly capable of replacing fence posts." "I did not say you were not," he said. "I said the corner posts are partly my responsibility. Do not make a fight out of an offer." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back, unhurried, neither challenging nor retreating, simply stating a position and waiting for her to come to reason. "All right," she said. "I will get the new posts and the post maul. I have them in the barn." "I have posts on the wagon," he said, jerking his head toward the road where, she now noticed, a ranch wagon was sitting. "Brought them when I saw this section was still down." She walked with him to the fence line, and they spent 2 hours working side by side, replacing 3 posts, resetting the wire, and bracing the corner properly with a diagonal support that she had not known to add. He explained why the diagonal was necessary. The tension of the wire would pull the corner post inward over time without it, and he explained it without condescension, the same way a person explains something to another person they consider capable of understanding. He did not ask her anything personal. He did not ask why she had come, or whether she planned to stay, or what she intended to do with the land. When they finished and she offered him water from the canteen she had brought out, he took it without ceremony, drank, handed it back. "The soil in that far field," he said, looking toward the eastern parcel. "You know it has clay." "I know," she said. "I am planning to work in compost and break it up through the summer. I want to plant winter wheat in the fall." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, as if she had answered a question he had not quite asked aloud. "That is the right approach," he said. "Take all summer. Do not rush it." He picked up the post maul and carried it back to her barn without being asked. She followed, and when he came out he mounted his horse and rode back to the road in the same unhurried way he did everything. He did not say goodbye, she realized. He had simply come, done the work, and left. She thought about that on the walk back to the house. In the weeks that followed, Lucy became a part of Dusty Creek in the way that people who work hard and show up consistently tend to become part of a place. She attended the Sunday service at the small white-boarded church on Elm Street, where the minister, Reverend Aldous, preached practical sermons and kept them short. She traded eggs and early garden vegetables with her neighbors. She learned that the clay soil in her eastern field responded best to being worked in the cool of the morning, before the sun hardened the surface. She ordered seeds from the catalog at George Fitch's Mercantile and started a kitchen garden that by late May was producing well enough that she had extra to sell. She saw Stephen Townsend perhaps once a week. He came through town on Fridays for his regular supply orders, and he would pass her on the street with a nod or a brief word about the weather or the state of the road. Occasionally, if she was at the Mercantile at the same time, they would speak for a few minutes about practical matters, the condition of the creek, whether the Benton Farms runoff was affecting the water quality downstream, whether the late rains had helped or hurt the winter wheat prospects. She began to understand, through these interactions and through the things she observed and the things people told her, that Stephen Townsend was not a cold man. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, known for quiet acts of help, extra feed left anonymously for a widow whose barn had burned, work done on the schoolhouse roof before anyone thought to organize a repair party, a horse doctored back to health for a family that could not afford the veterinarian. But he kept himself in a particular place, a place from which he could help without being touched by what he helped, and he maintained that distance with an almost architectural precision. She heard more of his story from Mabel, who told things with the frankness of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that context was a form of kindness. His parents had not been happy people. His father, Robert Townsend, had been a hard, driven man who had built the ranch from almost nothing and loved it with the kind of consuming devotion that left little room for people. His mother, Edna, had come to the marriage with hope and left it, by dying young, when Stephen was 13, without much of that hope having been realized. Robert Townsend had grieved his wife in the only way he knew, by working harder and expecting more of his son. And Stephen had grown up understanding that love was a thing that hurt people, and that the ranch was a thing that endured. Robert Townsend had died 4 years ago, leaving the spread to his son, who ran it with the same dedication and considerably more human decency than his father had managed. But the lesson had been absorbed young and deep, and no woman who had tried to breach it, and there had been a few, had succeeded. "He is not doing it to be cruel," Mabel told Lucy one evening in early June, when they were sitting on the boarding house porch in the cool of the evening. "He genuinely believes it. That he is not built for it, that it would only end in someone being made unhappy." "He is wrong about that," Lucy said. Mabel looked at her with sharp, kind eyes. "Yes," she said, "he is. But being wrong about something you have believed since you were 13 is not simple to fix." "I am not trying to fix him," Lucy said, honestly. "I am just not planning to pretend he is right." This was the truth. Lucy had not come to Dusty Creek to find a husband. She had come to build something of her own. But she was also a woman who trusted what she observed. And what she observed when she was with Stephen Townsend was a man who was more alive than he allowed himself to appear, who noticed things, who cared about things, who looked at the land and at the people on it with an attention that was too particular to be indifference. She thought that a man who could not love anyone would not have bothered to bring fence posts out on a Friday morning because a neighbor's corner section was still down. She thought that a man who was truly too proud to need other people would not teach a woman to work a rotted post without condescension, would not leave feed outside a widow's barn in the dark. She did not make a project of him. She did not maneuver or strategize. She simply continued to be herself and to treat him as she would treat anyone who interested her, with directness and good humor and an honest willingness to disagree. The first real disagreement came in mid-June, over water. The creek that ran along the shared boundary had been running low since May, and there was a question of whether the irrigation ditch that Harold had originally dug, and that crossed a corner of Townsend land by what her uncle had always maintained, was a verbal agreement with Robert Townsend, still gave her the right to draw water for her fields. A dry spring had made the question suddenly very practical, and when Lucy went to speak to Stephen about it, she found him in the near paddock working a young horse on a lunge line, moving the animal in slow circles with a patience and a quietness that made her pause for a moment at the fence before she called out. He stopped the horse and walked over, the lunge line looped in one hand. "My uncle told me there was an agreement with your father about the irrigation ditch," she said, getting directly to the point because she had found he preferred that. "I need to know if that agreement still holds." "There was an agreement," he said. "I know of it." "But," she said because she could hear the unspoken word. "But the creek is low," he said. "If you draw heavily from that ditch, it affects my stock water downstream." "I am not asking to draw heavily," she said. "I am asking for enough to keep my kitchen garden and the seedlings in the east field alive through a dry June. I am not trying to flood the land." "How much?" he asked. She told him, citing the numbers she had calculated them because she was thorough, and he was quiet for a moment, looking at the young horse who was standing quietly now, ears forward, watching them both. "That is reasonable," he said finally. "Use the ditch, but if the creek drops another foot, we will need to talk again." "Fair enough," she said. She turned to go, and he said, "You calculated the draw." She looked back. "Of course I did." He looked at her for a moment with that unreadable gray gaze, and she thought she saw something flicker there, something like respect, or perhaps its precursor, before he turned back to the horse. She walked home thinking about the way he had said, "Of course I did," back to himself. Probably, the way she had said it, as if it were the only sensible thing to do. July came in with a heat that sat on the valley like a hand pressed flat. The air shimmered over the fields by 10 in the morning, and the cattle stood at the creek shallows and stared at the sky with the sullen patience of animals that had no choice. Lucy rose before dawn to do her outdoor work and rested in the shade of the porch through the worst of the midday heat, using the time to mend things, to read the seed catalogs she had accumulated, to write the careful notes she kept about the soil and the weather and what she observed. It was during one of these midday porch rests in early July that 3 men she did not recognize rode onto her property. They came up the track from the road in a way that was not quite right, not the direct, purposeful approach of men with honest business, but the slow, wandering approach of men who were looking at what there was to look at. She was out of her chair and into the house before they reached the yard, and she came back out with the rifle her uncle had left in the house, which she had cleaned and loaded in her second week on the property because she was sensible. She stood on the porch and held the rifle in a way that communicated clearly she knew how to use it and was prepared to. "Help you," she said. The man in front was heavy-set, wearing a canvas coat that was too warm for July, and he had the look of a person who found other people's discomfort amusing. "Just passing through," he said. "Thirsty, thought you might spare some water." "There is a trough at the road," she said. "You passed it on the way in." "That's so," he said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Yes," she said. "So if it is water you need, you have it behind you. If it is something else, I need you to tell me clearly what it is and then leave." The man studied her for a moment. Then he looked at the rifle. Then he looked at the fields and the house and the barn in the way of someone calculating value. She kept her expression flat and her hands steady. "Nice piece of land," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Now turn your horses around." They did, but slowly, and with the kind of deliberateness that was itself a form of threat. She watched them go all the way to the road and turn south before she lowered the rifle, and she stood on the porch for a long moment afterward with her heart beating faster than she would have liked. She mentioned it to Sheriff Prout the next day when she went to town, and he took her description with the unhurried manner of a man who was not alarmed by very much, and said he would keep an eye out. She was less than fully satisfied with this response, but she understood there was not much more to be done on the information she had. She had not mentioned it to Stephen Townsend and did not intend to. It was her property and her concern, and she did not intend to go running to her neighbor every time something made her uncomfortable. But that evening, returning from town, she passed the boundary fence and saw him checking a section of his wire near the road, and something about the deliberate nature of the way he was standing facing the road, watching the southern approach, made her think he had already heard. "You spoke to Prout," he said when she pulled her wagon to a stop. "This morning," she said. "How did you know about the men?" "Pete Dawes saw them at the supply store," he said. "Asked around about water and asked whether the Langley place had a man on it." She felt the back of her neck prickle, not with fear but with a clear-eyed anger at the particular nature of that kind of calculation, that a property's vulnerability was assessed by whether a woman was alone on it. "I see," she said. "I have increased the patrol on the west boundary," he said, meaning his fence line, which was the boundary nearest the road they had taken south, "and I will know if they come back through." "I am not helpless," she said. "I handled them yesterday." "I know you did," he said, and there was no doubt in it, no performance of confidence in her. He simply knew it and said it. "I am not doing this because I think you cannot manage. I am doing it because they are the sort of trouble that is easier stopped early than late, and watching a boundary costs me nothing." She looked at him for a long moment in the low evening light. His hat threw a shadow across his eyes, but she could see his jaw, the set of his mouth, which was its usual composed line except for something at the corners, a kind of tension that was not quite worry but was adjacent to it. "Thank you, Stephen," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it, it had simply been what came out. He looked up at her from under the hat brim and she saw those gray eyes, and the thing that crossed them was quick and unmistakable surprise, real surprise, as if something had touched him in a place he had not expected to be reached, and then the composure came back down over it like a curtain. "Lucy," he said, in acknowledgement, and she thought it might have been the first time he had used her name either. She drove her wagon home and made supper and went to bed, and she lay in the dark listening to the night sounds of the valley coyotes far off, a barn owl over the fields, and she felt something settling in her chest, something quiet and certain, like an answer to a question she had been asking without knowing she was asking it. August arrived and the summer peaked and then very slowly began to relent. The mornings took on an edge of coolness that the afternoons still burned away, but it was there, and Lucy felt it with the deep satisfaction of a person who had worked all summer in heat and could now see the season beginning to turn toward the work she had been planning. The east field was responding. The clay soil she had been composting and turning all summer had softened considerably in the areas she had given the most attention to, and the test rows she had planted in June with turnips and beets had come in strong, not beautiful, but strong, which was what the soil needed to demonstrate. She had a real plan now for the winter wheat, 2.5 acres, which was conservative but right for a first planting on soil she was still learning. She had also, by August, become something she had not quite been in June, which was a person that Stephen Townsend sought out. It happened gradually and without announcement, in the way that things happen between two people who are both paying attention, but neither is willing to say they are. He had a habit, she learned, of riding the boundary fence on Tuesday and Friday mornings, which took him along the shared line and naturally past the point where the lane to her farmhouse met the road. He began to slow when he reached that point, and if she was about, which she usually was, since she worked the kitchen garden in the mornings, he would stop and they would talk. The conversations were, at first, entirely practical. The state of the east field, whether the irrigation ditch was running adequately, the price of wheat at the Milberg grain station, which was the nearest market, whether the first frost would come early or late this year. He thought late. She, observing the behavior of the woolly caterpillars in the field margins, thought early, and whether that mattered for the wheat planting schedule. But slowly, in the way that conversations between people who are genuinely paying attention to each other tend to expand, they moved into other things. He told her, one morning when she had offered him coffee from the tin she kept near the porch, that he had learned to read the weather from an old Comanche man who had worked on the ranch when Stephen was young, a man named Two Bears who had showed him how to watch the movement of birds and the behavior of cattle and the color of the western sky at dusk. He was a good man, Stephen said, holding the tin cup with both hands. A very good man. He was not supposed to be on the land. There was considerable opinion in town that my father ought to send him off. My father was not sympathetic to those opinions. On that one thing, he was not. Lucy heard the complexity in it, the acknowledgement of what his father had been, and the particular, careful note of credit for the thing his father had gotten right. That must have been hard, she said, being a Comanche man in the valley in those years. It was deeply unjust, Stephen said, simply and directly. The whole of it was unjust. The displacement, the confinement, the way men like Two Bears were treated as if their knowledge and their dignity were less real than a white man's. He looked out at the field. I was young and I did not understand the full shape of it. I understand it better now. He was generous to me with his knowledge, more generous than I had any right to expect from him. She looked at his profile, the direct line of his nose, the set of his jaw, and thought that this was not a man who was simple in his thinking, whatever else he had decided to be. You miss him, she said. He left when I was 16, Stephen said. Went back to his people, what was left of them. I was glad he could. He paused. And yes, I miss him. He finished the coffee and handed back the tin cup and looked at her with that gray gaze that had never been unkind, only guarded. You asked me once about the clay soil, he said. Two Bears told me that the Comanche understood this valley's soil better than any settler ever has. He said the eastern section drains east because the bedrock tilts. If you dig a drainage channel along the east edge of your field, running southeast, it will carry the clay water away in wet seasons and keep the root zone from compressing. She stared at him. That is exactly the problem I have been wrestling with, she said. I could not understand why the east corner of the field was not responding the way the rest was. The bedrock, he said, and stood and put his hat back on. Try the channel. She tried the channel that same week. He was right. She began to be aware, through August, of the way other people in town were watching them. Mabel watched with open speculation and warm approval. Pete Dawes watched with the delighted curiosity of a man who has a front seat at something interesting. George Fitch's wife, Clara, watched with the slightly anxious interest of a woman who wanted things to go well for both parties and was not certain they would. And several people, in the way that small towns in 1878 could not help themselves, told her things they thought she ought to know. She was told by Clara Fitch that 2 years ago a woman named Adeline Porter from the town of Brentwood had pursued Stephen Townsend with considerable determination and considerable charm, and that he had been polite, and had taken her to 2 Sunday church socials, and had then stated clearly and without cruelty that he was not in a position to offer anything more, and she had eventually married a banker in Millburg and seemed perfectly happy. She was told, by one of the women who had warned her at the stage, that Stephen had refused a very lucrative offer to sell the Townsend spread 2 years prior, and use the money to move to Denver and live comfortably, because he had said the land was not for selling, it was for working, and he could not imagine any life that was not rooted in this particular valley. She was told by Mabel, who told her things directly rather than as cautionary tales, that the summer Lucy arrived was the first summer in 4 years that Stephen Townsend had been seen genuinely talking, not merely conducting necessary business, with anyone who was not one of his ranch hands. He talks to you, Mabel said, one evening in late August with the matter-of-fact precision of a woman stating an observable fact. He rides that boundary fence twice a week and he stops at your lane and he stays. That is not nothing, Lucy. I know it is not nothing, Lucy said. What are you going to do about it? Nothing dramatic, Lucy said. I am going to keep being exactly who I am and see what he does with that. It was in September that things changed. The change began not with a declaration or an argument, but with a simple fact of timing. Lucy's barn roof, which had been borderline since she arrived, and which she had been managing with buckets and patches, chose the first heavy rain of September to give up the last of its structural integrity and come partially down on the east side. No animals were hurt. She had only 2 horses and they were in the paddock. But the damage was significant and the cost to repair it, priced out at the town lumber yard, was more than she had readily available in cash. Her kitchen garden income, her egg sales, and the small savings she had brought from Missouri were already committed to the wheat seed and the supplies she needed for the fall planting. She was standing in the barn looking up at the gap in the roof and calculating grimly when she heard a horse outside, and then Stephen Townsend was in the barn doorway, surveying the damage with the same direct attention he gave everything. "I saw the section come down from the road," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "The horses were outside, but the roof is done." He looked at the collapsed section, walked around the inside of the barn checking the remaining structure, crouched down to look at the base of the supporting posts, and stood. "The posts are sound," he said, "and the west wall, you need new rafters on the east side and new planking. The ridgepole is still good." "I know what it needs," she said. "I cannot afford it right now." He was quiet for a moment. "I have timber," he said. "Surplus from when we rebuilt the main barn 2 years ago. I could bring it Friday." "I cannot accept that," she said. "Not as charity." "It is not charity," he said. "You have an irrigation agreement that benefits your fields. I have a fence line that is better maintained since you took over this property than it was in the last 5 years of Harold's ownership. We have been neighbors in the practical sense all summer. This is a neighbor lending timber." She looked at him. He looked back the same patient, unchallenging way. "I will pay for the timber," she said. "Not now, but I will pay for it. We will write down what it is worth and I will pay it before spring." "Write it down then," he said. "I will bring the timber Friday." She found paper and a pencil in the house and came back, and they stood at the barn door and worked out a fair price for the timber, and she wrote it down, and he read it and said it was correct, and they both signed it. She was aware, with some amusement, that they had just drawn up a contract for a barn repair the way 2 people who intended to be serious with each other tended to do things. He brought the timber on Friday, and he brought 2 of his ranch hands, Cody and a young man called Walt, and they worked through the day and rebuilt the east side of the barn roof. Lucy fed them at midday. She had cooked since before dawn, biscuits and a pot of beans and smoked pork and apple cake she had made from the last of her summer apples, and they sat on the porch in the midday rest and ate. And Walt, who was 20 and cheerful, told her that the apple cake was the best thing he had eaten since Christmas, and Cody, who was older and quiet, said he agreed. Stephen ate without comment, but he ate 2 pieces of the apple cake, and she noticed. By late afternoon the roof was done sound, clean, better than it had been since she arrived. The ranch hands loaded up and drove back to the Townsend spread, and Stephen was the last to leave. He stood at the barn door looking in at the completed work with the satisfaction of a man who takes genuine pleasure in a thing done well. "It will hold," he said. "It will," she agreed. "Thank you, Stephen." He turned and looked at her, and she thought she saw it again, that thing she had first seen in July when she said his name, that flicker behind the composure, the brief evidence of something being moved that he had decided was not going to move. But it was stronger now, and it stayed longer before the composure came back. "I owe you for the apple cake," he said, and it was such an unexpected thing for him to say, small and almost light, almost the kind of thing a man might say if he were practicing being easy with someone, that she laughed, genuinely, before she could stop herself. He looked at her laugh with an expression that was naked for just a moment, startled by it, drawn to it, helpless against it in a way that he could not quite manage in the way he managed everything else, and then he put his hat on and walked to his horse. "Friday," he said, which was not goodbye but which she understood to mean he would be back on the boundary fence on Tuesday and Friday as he always was. "Friday," she said. She watched him ride out and stood in the yard in the September evening air, which smelled of turned earth and coming autumn, and felt something in her so clear and certain and true that it almost made her dizzy. She was in love with him. She had known it was coming, had felt it building all summer the way a season builds, gradually and inevitably, and now it had arrived and there was no ambiguity about it. She loved his steadiness and his directness and the unexpected depth of him, the way he had learned from a Comanche elder and kept that knowledge and credited it honestly. She loved the way he worked without ceremony and helped without drama. She loved his silences, which were not empty but full. She loved the gray of his eyes and the line of his jaw and the way he ate 2 pieces of apple cake without comment. And she was quite certain, based on everything she had observed and felt, that he was building toward loving her in return. Whether he would get there before harvest, whether he would allow himself to arrive at something he had decided was not for him, that was the question. But she believed in him more than he believed in himself, and she thought that might be enough. October came in with golden light and cool mornings, and a sense of the world drawing in toward its rest, and Lucy planted her winter wheat. She had prepared the 2.5 acres with the drainage channel Stephen had suggested, and the composting she had done all summer, and the soil was in the best condition she could manage for a first season. She rented the cedar from the Benton farm next door and spent 3 days walking the field, listening to the rattle of seed in the drum, watching the turned earth take it. There was something deeply satisfying about it that she had not been prepared for the act of trusting the earth with something, and believing it would return it multiplied. Stephen came by on Tuesday morning and found her on the last row and stopped his horse at the field edge and watched her finish it. When she reached the end and turned, he was still there, and there was something in his expression, in the quiet attention of it, the way he was watching her, that she held very still against, not wanting to disturb it. "How does it look?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Better than good. You have changed that field in 1 season." "I had good advice," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the planted field. "Lucy," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. He looked at his hands on the saddle horn. "I would like to take you to the harvest social on Saturday, at the church." The harvest social was the town's main autumn gathering, tables of food, fiddle music, the whole valley population turning out in their better clothes to mark the end of the growing season. She had been planning to go. She had not been planning to go with anyone. "I would like that," she said. He nodded once as if something had been formally confirmed. "I will come at 5, he said, "if that suits." "It suits," she said. He rode away down the fence line, and she stood in her freshly planted wheat field in the October morning light, and felt like laughing and crying at the same time, which she took as a reasonably reliable sign that she was very much in love. She spent more time than she intended to on her appearance on Saturday, which she acknowledged was not very sensible, and then decided was perfectly sensible because life was short, and the harvest social only happened once a year. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that was proper for October and good for dancing if there was dancing, and she braided her dark hair and pinned it and looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand and thought she looked well, and then thought about Stephen seeing her look well, and felt warmth move all the way through her. He came at 5 as promised, and he came in the wagon because that was more appropriate for the social than 2 horses, and he had put on his good coat, dark gray wool, clean and pressed, and his hair was neat under a hat that was newer than his trail hat. He helped her up into the wagon with a hand that held hers a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she felt the warmth of his palm and the roughness of his work-worn fingers, and thought this was a person she wanted to know the rest of her life. The drive to town was quiet but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that had grown up between them all summer, the kind that did not need filling. "Are you glad you came?" he said as they neared the lights of Dusty Creek. "To this valley?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Even the clay soil and the barn roof and the men on the road in July. Even those," she said. "I have found that the things that are worth having tend to require a certain amount of contending with." He looked at her in the dark of the wagon, the lights of town starting to catch his face, and she looked back at him, and she thought he was going to say something that mattered, something in the direction of what she had been saying all summer with her presence, her directness, her refusal to treat him as if he were beyond the reach of ordinary human love. Instead, he smiled. It was not a small smile or a polite one. It was real, spreading slowly from his mouth to his eyes, and it transformed his face in the way that a sunrise transforms a landscape, not changing anything, only revealing what had been there all along. She had never seen him fully smile before. She thought she might want to see it every day for the rest of her life. The harvest social was exactly what Dusty Creek did best when it put its collective heart into it. The church hall cleared of its pews and opened up, the tables along the walls bearing enough food to feed the county twice over, the fiddlers in the corner tuning, and then playing with the bright energy of men who have been waiting all summer for this. Everyone was there. Mabel, in a fine gray dress, holding a cup of cider and watching everything with satisfaction. Pete Dawes dancing badly but enthusiastically with his wife. Clara Fitch circulating with plates of apple butter cake. Reverend Aldous shaking hands with everyone. Even Sheriff Prout, looking more relaxed than Lucy had ever seen him. And everyone, absolutely everyone, looked when Stephen Townsend walked in with Lucy Langley on his arm, and she felt their looking as a warmth rather than a discomfort, because most of them were looking with the particular gladness of people watching something they had hoped for finally happening. Mabel caught her eye across the room and smiled with all the satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something important. They ate together at one of the tables and talked about the harvest, not just their own but the Valley's, who had done well and who had struggled, and what the wheat prices at Milburg were likely to do this winter. He told her that his spring calf numbers had been strong, and that he was planning to extend the south pasture next year with a new fence line that would take him down to the creek, in a direction he had not used before. She told him she was already planning the spring rotation, what would come in after the wheat, whether she could try oats in the north section. "You are planning as if you are staying," he said. "I am staying," she said, without any uncertainty. "This is my land and my home. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "Good," he said, and the word came out with a quiet conviction that told her it mattered to him more than just as a neighborly fact. The dancing started and several people danced, and it was gay and warm, and Lucy danced once with Pete Dawes and once with old Silas Crane, who was surprisingly good, and then Stephen was there at her elbow saying in that plain, low voice, "Would you dance with me?" And she put her hand in his, and he led her into the waltz that the fiddlers had shifted to. He was a better dancer than she expected, though she later thought she should not have been surprised. He did everything with competence, and dancing was something that took the same quality of attention and steadiness that he brought to everything else. She followed him easily, and they moved well together, and his hand was at her waist, and she was aware of every part of the space between them, which was proper but not distant. "I need to tell you something," he said, after they had been dancing for a while, looking down at her with those gray eyes that were darker in the lamplight of the hall. "Then tell me," she said. "I have been told," he said, "my whole life, and I have believed it, that I am not made for this." He gestured slightly, meaning not the dance specifically but everything it represented. "That loving someone was something I was not built for, that I was my father's son in that way as in every other way." She looked at him and did not say anything, because she could hear that he was going somewhere with this and it needed the space. "I have spent 8 months," he said, "since you arrived here, being shown by every single week that the thing I believed about myself is not true." He paused. "You showed me that, not by arguing with me about it. Just by being exactly who you are and refusing to act as if I were right." "You were not right," she said gently. "No," he said, "I was not." He stopped them at the edge of the dance floor where it was quieter and turned to face her properly, holding her hand still. "I do not know how to do this gracefully," he said, with a frankness that was very him, no performance, no borrowed language, just the direct truth of himself. "I have no practice at it, but I know I want to try. I know that every Tuesday and every Friday I ride that fence line specifically hoping to see you. And when I do, the day is different than when I do not. I know that your field and your work and the way you think and the way you laugh when I say something that surprises you, I know all of that has become the thing I think about when I am not with you." She felt her throat tighten with something that was entirely too much feeling to manage gracefully. "Stephen," she said. "I love you," he said, plainly, as if the plainness of it was the point, as if the most important thing was that there be no ambiguity, no hedging, no retreat built into it. "I do not say it because it is the thing to say at a harvest dance. I say it because it is the truest thing I know tonight." She had known for weeks that she loved him. She had known this conversation was coming, had felt it building the way she felt, whether with her whole body and without being able to say exactly when. But hearing him say it, hearing this man who had been told since boyhood that love was not his to have, say it plainly and without armor, looking at her as if she were the most real thing in the room, undid something in her in the best possible way. "I love you," she said, and she watched his face as she said it, watched the thing it did to him, the relief, the almost startled joy of it, the particular expression of a man receiving something he had not dared to fully hope for. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly and with great deliberateness, and she thought she would remember the sight of that Stephen Townsend, who had been told all his life he could not love anyone, pressing a kiss to her hand in the lamplight of the harvest social, for as long as she lived. "Now," he said, composing himself with the effort of a man who was new to being this unguarded, "can we please go back to dancing? Because I would rather be holding you than standing at the edge of the floor." She laughed the real laugh that she had first laughed in September, the one that had gotten past his defenses, and took his hand and they went back to dancing. Mabel watched all of it and said absolutely nothing, which was how anyone who knew her recognized that she was perfectly happy. In the weeks that followed the harvest social, something in Dusty Creek shifted in its understanding of Stephen Townsend, and Stephen Townsend shifted in his understanding of himself, and both shifts were gradual and good. He came to her farm not just on Tuesdays and Fridays now, but on Sundays after church, and sometimes in the evenings when the ranch work was done, and the visits were no longer limited to the practicalities of neighboring, but were the visits of two people who wanted to be in each other's company for the uncomplicated reason that they preferred it to being apart. He told her things she did not think he had told anyone. About his father, and the loneliness of growing up in a house where love was expressed only through the achievement of work. About his mother, whom he remembered not clearly. She had died when he was 13, but in fragments. A particular laugh, the smell of the bread she made on Saturdays, the way she had sat in the evening reading with her feet tucked up under her on the chair. About the grief of her absence and the way his father had sealed that grief over so completely that there had been no room for Stephen to place his own. "He was not a bad man," Stephen said one evening, sitting on her porch in the November cold, both of them in their coats with coffee. "He was a man who did not know how to hold more than one thing at a time. The ranch held him, and so he held the ranch. There was not much left over." "You are not him," Lucy said. "I know," he said. "I am beginning to know it." She rested her head briefly against his shoulder and felt him go very still and then settle, like a man who has recognized a home and stopped bracing himself against it. They were observed naturally because small towns observe things, and the observation was for the most part warm. There was one Sunday after church when Reverend Aldous shook both their hands at the door and held them a moment extra and said, "It is good to see you settled, Stephen," with the simple directness of a man who meant it without subtext, and Stephen had said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that carried more feeling than its brevity suggested. The men from July, the three from the road, came back in November. This time they were more direct about their intentions. They came at night and they attempted to break into her barn, probably to take the horses, and she heard them from the house and fired a warning shot from the bedroom window that sent them scattering. Stephen, whose ranch hands patrolled the perimeter, intercepted two of them at the road fence and held them there until Sheriff Prout arrived. The third escaped but was identified and later apprehended in Millburg on a separate charge. It was not a pleasant event, but it was contained and clean in its resolution, and Lucy was more angry than frightened. Stephen came to the farm the next morning, the very early morning, before dawn had fully resolved into day, and found her in the kitchen making coffee, entirely composed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was beyond words, the mutual recognition of what they were to each other, of what it would have meant if last night had gone differently. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I am perfectly all right." "Come in and have coffee." He came in and sat at her kitchen table and had coffee, and she sat across from him. And after a while he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything that needed saying because the hand said it. December came with early frost and the particular beauty of a prairie winter settling in, the long silver mornings, the clear cold afternoons, the way the dormant wheat fields looked like brushed suede in the slanted winter light. Lucy learned that this valley in winter had a quiet and a stillness that was its own kind of abundance. She was not lonely in it. She had her neighbor, her valley, her work, and she had Stephen. Stephen Townsend, on a Saturday morning in mid-December, came to her farm not on his usual schedule but with a particular intentionality that she recognized in him because she had learned to read him as well as she read weather. He sat across from her at the kitchen table where they had had coffee many times by now, and he looked at his hands and then at her and said, "I am not good at speeches." "I know," she said. "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said, in the same tone she had used in a different context many months ago at a fence line, when she had told him to come in and say what he needed to say and not make a fight out of an offer. He reached into the pocket of his coat and set a small ring on the table between them. It was simple, a gold band with a small setting, not elaborate, but it was real and it was his, and she could see from the wear on the band that it had been his mother's. "This was Edna's," he said. "I have been carrying it for 2 weeks, trying to find the right way to ask. I do not think there is a right way. There is just this. I want to marry you, Lucy. I want you to be my wife. I want to build something with you that is better than what either of us could build alone. I know you are already building something fine on your own land, and I am not suggesting you stop. I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking whether you would be willing to build alongside me as well." She looked at the ring on the table between them, and then she looked at him, and she thought about the morning she had arrived in Dusty Creek and been told he was too proud to love anyone. She thought about every fence post and every field and every cup of coffee on this porch, and she thought about the harvest social and the way he had said, "I love you," with all the plain earnestness of a man who had waited a long time to say something true. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger with hands that were not entirely steady, and she covered his hands with hers for a moment, and they sat across from each other in her kitchen in December with the winter light coming through the window, and she thought that this was the most real thing she had ever experienced, and she wanted to live inside this realness for the rest of her days. They were married in February at the white-boarded church on Elm Street on a day that was cold and perfectly clear, the sky a blue so deep it looked painted. The whole town came. Mabel wept openly and without embarrassment. Pete Dawes and his wife stood in the second row beaming. Old Silas Crane sat in the front pew and blew his nose into a handkerchief at the vows. Even Sheriff Prout looked moved, which surprised everyone including himself. Reverend Aldous read the vows and Stephen said them in his plain, unhurried voice, looking at Lucy the whole time with those gray eyes that she had once been told were like the sky before a storm, and that she now knew were like the sky after one cleared, wide open, unguarded. She said her own vows looking back at him, and meaning every word with the specificity and fullness that only people who have actually chosen each other, who have seen each other in clay soil work and barn repair and 3 a.m. coffee after a frightening night can manage. She meant the sickness and health. She meant the better and worse. She meant all of it. After the ceremony, in the reception that Mabel organized at the church hall and that involved considerably more food than the harvest social had and nearly as much dancing, Lucy overheard Clara Fitch say to Mabel, "6 months ago I would have said it would never happen." And Mabel, refilling her cup, said, "I would have said 6 months ago that it was already happening, Clara. The only question was when he would catch up to the obvious." And Clara said, "She waited him out," and Mabel said, "She did not wait at all. She simply was herself completely and let him see it, and he came to his own senses in his own time. That is not waiting, that is a great deal of faith." Lucy, hearing this from 2 feet away, decided not to announce that she had heard it and instead went to find her husband. Her husband was standing at the edge of the hall speaking to Cody and Walt, and when he saw her coming, he stopped the conversation with the unself-conscious ease of a man who has genuinely stopped finding it difficult to show that a person matters to him, and he held out his hand and she took it and he folded it into his own. "Ready to go," he said. "Not yet," she said. "I want one more dance." He smiled, that full, real smile that she had first seen in October on the wagon into town, and that she intended to see for the rest of her life, and took her to the dance floor. Spring came that year with the kind of generosity that a prairie valley after a hard winter sometimes offers rains at the right intervals, warmth without burning, the wheat in Lucy's east field coming up in the even, promising green of seedlings that had wintered well and were ready to earn their place. She walked the field in March and then in April, and watched it with a satisfaction that she shared with no one except Stephen, who came with her sometimes in the evenings to stand at the field edge and look at it. They had worked out the practical aspects of their joining with the same directness they brought to everything. Her farmland remained hers, titled and recorded in her name at the county land office, which was important to her, and which he understood without needing it explained. She moved into the ranch house on the Townsend spread, which was larger and better equipped, but she kept the farmhouse maintained and occupied the land as her own working property. The wheat field and the kitchen garden were hers to manage. She hired Sela's crane 2 days a week to help with the heavier work, and she paid him from her own accounts. The ranch house was a good house, stone foundation, 4 rooms, solid in the way of something built to last. She made it different from how it had been, not completely but in the ways that matter. Curtains at the windows, a proper kitchen garden off the south wall, books on the shelf in the front room next to Stephen's reference volumes on cattle husbandry and land management. He came home at the end of working days to the smell of cooking and the sight of lamplight in the windows, and she saw, in the first weeks, how much that meant to him, the simple evidence of another person's presence, of not returning to an empty house, of being expected and welcomed. It was good. It was genuinely, sustainably, practically good, which she found was the best kind of good there was. By May she knew she was expecting a child, and she told him on a morning when they were both in the kitchen before the workday started. In the plain, direct way she told him everything important. She watched his face and saw it pass through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then a dawning wonder, and then the expression of a man who is being shown that his life is becoming something larger and more real than he had dared to count on. He crossed the kitchen and held her, properly and close, with the kind of embrace that says everything the words cannot reach, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him against her, warm and solid and entirely present. And she thought about the woman who had arrived in Dusty Creek on a spring stage and had been told this man was too proud to love anyone, and she thought, "Look at him now. Are you well?" He said into her hair, "Are you feeling well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am excellent." She felt him exhale against the top of her head, a long, releasing breath. "All right," he said, "all right." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer. Lucy continued to manage her wheat field and her garden, modifying the heavier work as the months advanced, with Sela's crane taking on more of the physical labor. She was not a woman who retreated from her life when her body was working to build something else. She was merely a woman who adapted her approach while keeping the work going, which was what she did with everything. Stephen was attentive in a way that she loved because it was his particular version of attentiveness. Not hovering, not anxious, not attempting to take things out of her hands, but present and watching, and quick to offer and quick to do when she needed it. He came to the east field with her on his Tuesday and Friday mornings still, riding beside her on foot now that she was far enough along to want company on the longer walks, and they talked about the wheat, which was looking excellent, and about the baby, which was not yet visible to anyone but them but was entirely real. Dr. Bray, who was indeed competent and sober as advertised, came to check on her at intervals and express satisfaction. He told her in August, in his plain medical way, that everything was proceeding as it should, and that she was strong and in good health, and he anticipated no complications. Stephen sat in the front room during this visit, which Dr. Bray observed with the private approval of a man who had seen a number of husbands treat pregnancy as a matter to be delegated rather than shared. The wheat came in August, her first harvest. It came in better than she had let herself hope, the 2.5 acres yielding a crop that the Milberg grain station priced well, better than she had calculated in her most optimistic estimates. She stood in the cut field in the August heat and looked at what she had done with Harold's stubborn, clay-streaked, east-tilting land, and felt a triumph that was quiet and deep and entirely her own. Stephen was there when she got back from delivering the first load to the grain station, sitting on the porch steps of the farmhouse because he knew she would want to come back to the farm itself, not the ranch house, when she had the numbers. She told him the yield price and watched him process it. "That is very good," he said. "I know," she said, "better than I would have predicted in the spring. The drainage channel made the difference," she said, "and the composting and the planting timing and the variety I chose," she paused, "and the good advice I had." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were clear and bright and completely open, no shutters, no distance, no careful positioning of himself out of reach, just him. "You did this," he said. "The advice was just information. You did the work." She sat down next to him on the porch steps and leaned against his arm, and he put his arm around her, which was not something they had done very often in this particular way, side by side and leaning, but which felt entirely natural. "I want to plant 3 acres next year," she said. "Now I know the field." 3 acres is right," he said. "The southeast corner could take a 4th if you want to push it." "Let me prove 3 first," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is right." They sat on the porch steps of her farmhouse in August, and the valley stretched out before them, late summer bronze and green, and the sky was enormous and clear. And inside her there was new life working away at its own project. And beside her was this man who had been told he was too proud to love anyone and who had put his arm around her on these steps as easily as breathing. Their son was born in November, 2 weeks before the first significant snow, in the ranch house with Dr. Bray attending, and Mabel Greer present as well because Lucy had wanted her there, and Mabel had not required much persuading. Stephen was in the house the entire time, which Dr. Bray noted was unusual and which he approved of, and when the child arrived healthy, loud, decidedly present in the world, and Dr. Bray placed him in Lucy's arms and she looked at him for the first time, she heard Stephen make a sound that she had never heard from him before, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, but was entirely undisguised feeling, raw and uncalculated and completely real. She looked up at him and his face was, she could not find words for it adequate to the actual thing, stripped of every careful posture and open as the sky, looking at her and at this child with an expression that she thought only people who have been shown conclusively that love is possible, that they are capable of it and worthy of it, where when the proof arrives in full. "Hello," she said to the baby, and then to Stephen because he needed to hear it. "Come here." He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she moved the child into the space between them, and Stephen put out one large, work-rough hand, and the baby, with the instinct of new things, curled his tiny fingers around one of Stephen's. Neither of them said anything for a long time. There was nothing needed. They named him Robert James Townsend, Robert for Stephen's father, with the intention of remaking the name in a better direction, and James for Lucy's grandfather, a man she had loved and missed. He was called Rob from his first week, and he was, from the beginning, a person with his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, which seemed to everyone who knew both parents to be about the best possible combination. Mabel was his unofficial grandmother and treated the role with full commitment. She was at the ranch house so regularly in Rob's first months that Stephen once said, in the dry tone that was his version of humor, that they might as well build her a room, and Mabel had looked at him over the baby's head and said, "That is the best idea you have ever had, Stephen Townsend," and neither of them had entirely been joking. The winter of that year was long and cold in the way of Kansas winters, and they spent it in the ranch house with the fire and the baby and the books and the long evenings that Lucy had come to love deeply. The particular domesticity of an evening when the work was done, and the child was fed, and the fire was going, and there was nothing required of either of them except to be present with each other. Stephen read in the evenings. He read cattle husbandry and land management and, increasingly, other things. A battered copy of Dickens that Lucy had brought from Missouri, a history of the plains that she had ordered from the catalog. He read seriously and slowly, the way he did everything, and he talked about what he read with a thoughtfulness that continued to show her, every time, that this was a man who had been underestimated by others and especially by himself. He also, in that winter, talked more about his mother. Not frequently, and not with the kind of working over that suggests unresolved grief, but in the natural way of a man who has found someone safe to share memories with and is no longer afraid that sharing them will undo him. He told her about the bread and about the reading in the chair and about the way Edna had laughed at Robert's jokes even when they were not funny, which was the only evidence Stephen had that his father had ever made jokes at all. "I think she loved him," Stephen said once. "In spite of everything, I think she made her peace with how much he could give, and she loved him within that." "That is generous of her," Lucy said. "It is," he said. "I think I used to think it was a sad story, her story. Now I think it is a complicated one. I think she found meaning in it." "People do," Lucy said. "It does not mean it was enough, but people find meaning in what they have." "You would not have done it," he said, looking at her with the directness he had developed for the most important things. "You would not have settled for someone who could only give you part of himself." "No," she said honestly, "I would not have." "I know," he said, "and that is why I had to be all of myself, because you would have known if I were not." She reached over and touched his face, which she did not do often because he was not a man who needed constant physical reassurance, but which she did when it mattered. He covered her hand with his. "You are all of yourself," she said. "You have been for a long time." Spring came back as it always did, and with it the business of the land in its full urgency. Lucy planted 3 acres of wheat in the east field as she had planned, and added the southeast corner tentatively, taking it to 3¼ The drainage channel she had dug the previous year had improved so thoroughly in the second winter that the corner that had been the most stubborn came into the spring with the best soil she had had in the field. She also planted oats in the north section of the farm, which she had been planning since her first year. The oats did well in the looser soil up there, and gave her a second income stream from the farm, and a use for the section that had been underperforming. Rob, now past his first winter and moving with the determined energy of a child who has decided the world is fully available to him, was present for all of this in the way of young children on working farms hauled along, set down in safe places, observed and marveled at, and kept from eating dirt with varying degrees of success. Stephen took him on the horse for the first time in April. Rob in front of him in the saddle, held securely, looking at the world from a new height with an expression of enormous satisfaction. And the image of them, Stephen on the great ungelding with their son held in his arms in front of the saddle, was one that Lucy kept in the deepest part of her memory, alongside the image of Stephen's hands receiving the ring at the fence post and the harvest social smile. The second harvest was better than the first. 3¼ acres of wheat and the North Oats together gave her a season that more than paid the remaining timber debt and funded the improvements she wanted to make to the farmhouse. A new kitchen roof, a proper smokehouse, an expansion of the kitchen garden with a cold storage cellar beneath it. She had become, by the end of the second growing year, a farmer in the full meaning of the word, not trying the land but knowing it, not testing her methods but refining them, not hoping to survive but genuinely building. And she had become, in a way she had not specifically planned but recognized as the best thing that had happened to her, exactly where she belonged. In this valley, on this land, with this man who had been told all his life that love was not his and who had proven, by harvest time and beyond it, that the story he had been handed was simply wrong. It was in the autumn of that second year, at another harvest social, the same church hall, the same fiddlers, the same tables of food and the same valley population, that Lucy found herself standing with Mabel and Clara Fitch near the porch door, and Clara said, remembering something, "Do you know what the very first thing anyone told you about him was? That he was too proud to love anyone." "I remember," Lucy said. "Look at him," Clara said. Lucy looked. Stephen was across the room holding Rob, who at almost a year old was standing in his father's arms and watching the dancers with the concentrated attention of a small person storing up information. Stephen was saying something to his son, close to his ear, and Rob was looking at the dancers and Stephen was looking at Rob with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated love. No armor, no pride, no careful distance, just a father looking at his child. "You changed him," Clara said. "He changed himself," Lucy said. "I just did not let him believe he could not." Mabel, who had been listening with her cup of cider and the expression of a woman who had been right about something and was too wise to gloat, said, "That is exactly what good love does. It does not change a person. It refuses to believe in the smaller version of them." Lucy looked at her husband and her son across the hall, and she felt the same certainty she had felt on the day she planted her first wheat field. The feeling of having trusted something and been given back more than she had given. Stephen looked up, the way people who are attuned to each other do, and found her across the room, and that smile real, full, the one she had first seen on the wagon into town on harvest social night the year before, crossed his face. He shifted Rob to his hip and raised one hand to her, not waving, just acknowledging, just saying, "I see you, I know where you are, I am glad." She lifted her own hand in return. The fiddlers played. The hall was warm with lamplight, and the sound of a valley celebrating another year made and survived. Lucy Langley Townsend stood with her friends and her apple cider in the harvest light and knew herself to be thoroughly, permanently, completely at home. Mabel, 2 weeks later, did in fact accept the offer of the room they had been half joking about, because the boarding house had been sold to a younger couple and she was, as she said, neither old enough to retire nor young enough to start over, and I have better things to do with my time than cook for strangers. She moved into the east room of the ranch house and became so entirely woven into the household that Rob, when he eventually began to call her anything specific, called her Grandma Mabel, as if it were obvious, and everyone agreed that it was. Silas Crane, now in his mid-60s and slowing only slightly, continued to work the Langley fields 2 days a week, and was the most reliable person in the county to call when something needed building or bracing. He was at Lucy's kitchen table for coffee so regularly that Stephen once came in at 7 in the morning to find Silas already there, and had simply poured himself a cup and sat down, and Silas had said, "Morning," and Stephen had said, "Morning," and they had sat in companionable silence until Lucy came in from the garden, at which point both of them immediately had opinions about the drainage on the north section that they had apparently been saving up. The Townsend spread expanded in the third year when a neighboring property to the south came up for sale, and Stephen bought it at a fair price. The additional pasture allowed him to increase the herd significantly and take on a second full-time hand, a young Texan named Arvis who was 16 when he arrived and 19 by the time he had worked himself into a permanent place, and who was the first person outside the immediate household to be trusted completely with the running of the south pasture. In the spring of the third year, Lucy learned she was expecting again, and she told Stephen in the kitchen again, at the same table, in the same plain way. His face did the same thing it had done the first time, the wonder moving through it, the openness, the uncovering of feeling that he no longer had to manage around. "Are you well?" he said for the second time. "I am excellent," she said for the second time. "All right," he said. "All right." They grinned at each other in the kitchen in the spring morning light, with Rob playing on the floor with a wooden horse that Stephen had carved over the winter in the evenings, and the sound of Mabel starting breakfast in the background, and the smell of coffee, and outside the window the beginning of another season on land that knew them and that they knew. The second child arrived in November again, which Lucy thought privately was just a preference their children had for November. She was a girl dark-haired like her mother, with her father's gray eyes, and they named her Edna Claire Townsend. Edna for Stephen's mother and Claire for Lucy's own mother, gone 10 years now, and the naming felt like a remaking of grief into something else, something that carried the weight of loss and also the lightness of continuation. She was called Eddie almost immediately by Rob, who was nearly 2 and in possession of firm opinions about how things should be named, and Eddie she remained to everyone in the household for the rest of her childhood, which turned out to suit her very well. Lucy, standing in the field one morning in the spring of the fourth year with Rob at her side and Eddie in the sling across her chest, looked out across the east field that she had turned from stubborn clay into productive farmland over 4 hard seasons of work, and thought about the day she had stepped off the stage in Dusty Creek with one bag, and no one waiting for her and 3 women telling her that the most capable man in the valley was too proud to love anyone. She thought about every fence post and every cup of coffee and every conversation at the boundary line. She thought about the harvest social and the waltz and the plain, brave, unhesitating way he had said, "I love you," in a room full of people who had watched him for years hold himself at arm's length from everything that word implied. She thought about the ring on her finger, which was worn now in the way of rings that are worn constantly and with intention. She thought about him, last night, sitting by the fire with Eddie asleep on his chest and Rob leaning against his arm, and a book open on his knee that he was not reading because he was watching his children sleep, and the expression on his face was the most tender thing she had ever seen. She thought, they told me he was too proud to love anyone. They were wrong, she thought. He was not too proud. He was afraid and he was hurt and he had been badly taught. But inside all of that was always this capacity, this particular, reliable, daily willingness to show up and stay and build and hold. This man who checked boundary fences and brought timber and said, "I love you," plainly in lamplight and carved wooden horses in the evenings, and held his daughter while she slept. She had not fixed him. She had simply refused to believe the smaller version of him that he had been handed, and he had come, in his own time and in his own way, to the truth of himself. Rob tugged at her hand. She looked down at him, 2 years old, looking up at her with Stephen's gray eyes in her own face, which was the strangest and most beautiful combination. "Wheat," he said, pointing at the field because he knew what this field was and what it meant. "Yes," she said, "our wheat." She shifted Eddie in the sling and took Rob's hand, and they walked the field edge together in the spring morning light. And behind them, coming down the lane from the road, She could already hear the sound of Stephen's horse because he was on his way back from the morning check, and he would stop at the field before he went on to the barn, because he always did, because this was the field his wife had built, and he never stopped wanting to see how it was doing. She heard the horse stop and heard him dismount, and she turned, and he was at the field edge, and he looked at her and at the children and at the greening rows of new wheat, and he looked as if the world were exactly right, which was, Lucy thought, because for them it was. "Coming in," she said. "In a minute," he said. "I want to look at it." She watched him look at the field she had made from nothing, from clay soil and stubborn ground, and 4 years of getting up before dawn and working until the light was gone. And she thought that this, right here, this ordinary spring morning on a Kansas farm in 1882, was what she had come to this valley for. Not just the land, not just the wheat, all of it. This whole particular irreplaceable life. "Stephen," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said, because she liked to say it, liked the way it still moved something in him every single time, liked that they were the kind of people who said it out loud in a field in the morning. "I love you," he said back, without hesitation, without armor, as if it were the easiest and most natural thing in the world, which, she thought, for him now it was. Rob broke free of her hand and ran toward his father, which was what Rob always did, and Stephen caught him and swung him up, and they both looked at Lucy and Eddie and the field and the morning, and it was all of it at once, the past and the present and the clear, settled, completely certain future. The wheat grew. The valley held them. And Stephen Townsend, who had been told all his life that he was too proud to love anyone, stood in his wife's field in the spring of 1882 with his son on his arm and his daughter in her mother's arms, and proved beyond any remaining doubt that he had been wrong to believe it, and that she had been right to make him see it, and that this life, this love, this completely specific and irreplaceable thing was the best thing either of them had ever built.